Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The metallic sound of a sledgehammer hitting metal stakes echoed across Oregon's Willamette River Valley as Alice Bennett watched in disbelief as her neighbor Margaret Foster marked out what she insisted was her property. The scene might seem comical: a middle-aged woman in designer gym clothes driving stakes into the ground on a Monday morning, if it weren't for the two-story garage the Fosters had built over the weekend, clearly within the boundaries of Alice's land. "Margaret, you need to stop this now!" Alice shouted, her hands shaking as she held up her cell phone, recording everything. "This land belongs to me, and you know it." Margaret Foster stood up, adjusting her expensive sunglasses over her upturned nose. "Oh dear," she replied with a condescending smile. "You really need to catch up. The river changed its course in the last floods. It's altered the boundaries of the properties. Howard surveyed everything." Alice felt her face heat up. The Riverfront property in West Lynn had been her refuge since her divorce 3 years ago. Every inch of that land was documented, measured, and recorded. The idea that the Fosters could simply decide which part of it now belonged to them was absurd. Howard Foster emerged from the newly built garage carrying a folder of documents. As president of the Riverside Heights Homeowners Association, he always dressed as if he were about to enter a board meeting, even at a time like this. "Alice, we have some maps here that clearly show the change in the course of the river." He began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she hated so much. "As president of the HOA, I have the authority to—" "You have no authority whatsoever over the boundaries of my property, Howard," Alice interrupted him, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "And this construction is completely illegal. You have no permission from the city, let alone my permission to build on my land." The Fosters exchanged looks of superiority that made Alice's blood boil. She had dealt with their arrogance since moving into the neighborhood, tolerating their constant attempts to control every aspect of the residents' lives through the HOA. But this was different. This was blatant theft. Robert Wilson, the surveyor Alice had called in an emergency, arrived at that moment, his precision equipment in hand. Robert was known in the region for his experience in territory disputes, and his presence made Margaret's smile falter slightly. "Mr. Foster," Robert greeted with a professional nod, immediately beginning to set up his equipment. "Let's establish some facts here." As Robert worked, Alice noticed other neighbors beginning to gather discreetly to watch the drama unfold. Barbara Chen, her neighbor on the other side, approached with a cup of coffee. "They did this over the long holiday on purpose," Barbara whispered. "They hired a construction crew who worked day and night. I thought about calling you, but—" "But you were afraid of messing with the Fosters," Alice added, understanding perfectly. The Fosters had made Barbara's life a living hell the year before, when she dared to paint her house a shade of blue, not approved by the HOA. Robert finished his measurements in record time, his face serious as he looked up data on his tablet. "Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Foster, I have here the official coordinates of the property, correlated with the geodetic landmarks in the area. There's no doubt about it, this garage is entirely within the legal boundaries of Mrs. Bennett's property." "Impossible!" Margaret exclaimed, her voice rising several notches. "Howard, show him our maps." "Mrs. Foster." Robert continued unperturbed. "Changes in the course of a river do not automatically alter the legal boundaries of properties. Besides, the changes in the course of the Willamette in this stretch have been minimal in the last 50 years, certainly not enough to affect these boundaries." Alice felt a wave of relief mixed with a growing determination. "I want that structure removed from my property immediately," she declared, her voice firmer now. Howard adjusted his tie, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. We spent a fortune on this garage. We're not going to demolish it because of a few disputed centimeters. Centimeters? Alice laughed humorlessly. The entire garage is on my land, and you knew that when you built it. Why else would you have chosen to do it during a long holiday? More neighbors had approached, forming a small crowd. Alice could feel the tension in the air, years of resentment against the Fosters' authoritarian rule in the HOA beginning to bubble to the surface. "This isn't over," Margaret declared, gathering her things. "Howard, call our lawyer." "I've already called mine," Alice replied, showing her cell phone, "and the city's building department. You have 48 hours to remove this structure, or I'll take legal action." As the Fosters left for their home, Alice stood there observing the illegal garage that now marred her property. She was aware that this would only be the first battle in a larger war. The Fosters were not known for accepting defeat easily, and as leaders of the HOA, they had considerable resources and influence in the neighborhood. Barbara touched his arm gently. "You're going to need help," she said softly. "They're going to make your life hell." Alice nodded, her eyes still fixed on the invading structure. "I know, but we've spent too long letting them do what they want. It has to end at some point." Robert. Wilson finished putting away his equipment, approaching with a printed report. "I'm going to certify all these measurements officially later today," he informed. "If you need me in court, I'll be available to testify." Alice thanked him, realizing that her quiet life by the river was about to turn into something very different. But as she watched the Fosters through her window, gesticulating furiously into the phone, she felt a growing determination. Some fights needed to be fought, no matter what the cost. The next morning, Alice woke up to the sound of engines. Running to the window, she saw a construction crew installing a high fence around the illegal garage, while Howard Foster supervised the operation with a satisfied smile on his face. "You can't be serious," she muttered, picking up her phone, to document yet another violation. As she descended the stairs, she found an official HOA envelope slid under her door. Inside, a formal notice alleging multiple neighborhood code violations, including improper maintenance of landscaping and unapproved architectural elements. The phone rang while she was still holding the notice with trembling hands. It was Patricia Dawson, her lawyer. "Alice, I got your messages. I've just reviewed the documentation you sent," Patricia said, without preamble. "The Fosters have no legal basis for this, but they are playing dirty. These HOA fines are clearly retaliation." "They're building a fence right now," Alice reported, watching from the window. "How can they keep building when we've already proven that the land is mine?" "Because they're counting on the time of the legal process," Patricia explained. "The more structures they add, the more they can argue about irreparable damage if they're forced to remove everything. We need an injunction immediately." Alice heard a knock on her door. It was Barbara Chen, looking agitated. "Call me later," Alice told the lawyer, going to open the door. "Alice, you need to see this," Barbara said, handing her her tablet. On the screen, there was a Facebook group from the neighborhood where Margaret Foster had posted a long message accusing Alice of stalking and hostile behavior against respectable members of the community. "She's turning this into a media circus," Barbara continued. "But look at the comments." To Alice's surprise, many neighbors were speaking out in her support. Years of the Fosters' authoritarianism had created a reservoir of resentment that was now overflowing. Jennifer Martinez, who had her community garden closed by order of the Fosters, shared her own story of abuse of power. Richard Thompson, a retiree, who almost lost his home due to exorbitant HOA fines, offered to testify about the couple's pattern of behavior. "This could help your case," Barbara suggested. "It shows a pattern of abusive behavior." Before Alice could respond, a municipal truck pulled up in front of her house. A man in uniform approached with a clipboard. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm Kevin Morris from the Department of Works. We've received a complaint about unauthorized modifications to your property." Alice laughed humorlessly. "Let me guess, the Fosters made the complaint." "Yes, ma'am. Something about an uneven deck and structural modifications without permission." "Interesting," Alice replied, leading Kevin to the back of the house. "Because while you're investigating these bogus allegations, you might want to take a look at that illegally built garage on my land over the holidays." Kevin frowned at the sight of the structure. "That wasn't in the records I reviewed this morning." "Of course it wasn't. You don't have any permission. I have a surveyor's report confirming that it's on my property." While Kevin was examining the situation, Alice noticed movement in the Foster house. Howard was on the phone gesticulating furiously as he watched the scene through the window. Margaret rushed out, dressed impeccably as always. "Mr. Morris," Margaret called out in her sweetest voice, "there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We have all the necessary documentation in the process of being approved." "In process is not approved, Mrs. Foster," Kevin replied dryly, "and building without prior approval is a violation of the municipal code." Margaret's smile faltered. "Surely we can resolve this in a civilized manner. Perhaps during our next charity event, you and your wife would be our guests of honor." Alice watched the thinly veiled bribery attempt with a mixture of disgust and admiration for the audacity. Kevin, however, just continued, writing on his clipboard. "Mrs. Foster, I'm issuing an immediate stop work order for all construction in this area. The fence being installed needs to be removed until the property issue is resolved." "That's outrageous," Howard thundered, joining the group, as president of the HOA. "The HOA has no authority over municipal zoning issues, Mr. Foster," Kevin interrupted him, "and building without a permit is serious business." As the discussion continued, Alice noticed other neighbors approaching. Barbara had sent messages to the support group that was forming online, and now several people were recording the scene with their cell phones. "You can't intimidate us anymore," declared Jennifer Martinez, approaching with her cell phone in hand. "Gone are the days when you guys ran everything around here." Howard turned to her, his face red with anger. "This is a conspiracy. You're all trying to destroy everything we've built in this neighborhood." "What you built was a regime of fear," Richard Thompson replied, his calm voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "And regimes like that always fall, Howard." Alice watched the scene unfold, realizing that her personal battle had turned into something bigger. It was no longer just about an illegal garage. It was about years of abuse of power and control, finally reaching breaking point. His phone vibrated with a message from Patricia. "Injunction granted. Bailiff on his way with the order." "Mrs. Foster," Alice called out, interrupting the heated discussion. "The courts have just granted an injunction preventing any further construction and ordering the removal of what has been built illegally. I suggest you stop installing the fence now before this becomes another legal problem for you." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of more cars arriving. This time, a bailiff's vehicle and a local television car. Apparently, someone had alerted the press about the confrontation. Margaret looked panikedly at Howard, her facade of superiority finally cracking. "Do something!" But for the first time since Alice had met him, Howard Foster seemed to have no answer. The man who ruled the neighborhood with threats of fines and regulations was being cornered by his own tactics, and the irony escaped no one. News of the dispute in Riverside Heights spread like wildfire through the local news in West Lynn. Channel 6 showed aerial footage of Alice's property, highlighting the illegal garage and partially built fence while reporting the story of what was fast becoming a symbol of the fight against the abuse of power by HOAs. Alice watched her television with a mixture of anxiety and determination as reporter Jessica Chen detailed the charges against the Fosters. Sources indicate that this is not an isolated incident. Several residents report years of questionable practices in the administration of the Homeowners Association. Alice's phone rang, interrupting her concentration. It was Patricia Dawson again. The Fosters have filed a countersuit, her lawyer informed her bluntly. They're claiming moral damages and defamation. They also got an emergency hearing with Judge Harrison for tomorrow morning. Defamation? Alice asked in disbelief. They invade my property, and I'm accused of defamation. It's a common tactic, Patricia explained. They're trying to put financial pressure on you, but there's more. I've discovered something interesting about the HOA's finances. Alice sat down in her favorite armchair, the one overlooking the river. Go on. Over the last 3 years, there have been significant transfers from the HOA's account to a consulting company called Foster Enterprises. Apparently, it's run by the Foster's son who lives in Seattle. Let me guess, overpriced services. Bingo! And there's more, the garage they built. It was partially paid for with HOA funds under the justification of being an emergency community structure. Alice felt her stomach turn. It wasn't just about a turf dispute. It was about years of possible financial fraud. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Jennifer Martinez, accompanied by Richard Thompson and 3 other neighbors Alice recognized from the online support group. Sorry to show up unannounced, Jennifer began, but we thought you should know. The Fosters are calling a special HOA meeting for tonight. They want to vote you out of the community. They can't do that, Richard added quickly, seeing Alice's expression. It's completely illegal, but it shows their desperation. Alice invited the group in, noticing how her living room had quickly turned into a makeshift resistance headquarters. Barbara Chen arrived minutes later, carrying old folders of HOA documents she had saved over the years. Look at this, Barbara said, spreading papers out on the coffee table. In 2019, the Fosters tried to do something similar with the Rodriguez. They forced them to sell the house after a series of fabricated fines. And here, Jennifer pointed to, another document, the supposed environmental study they used to close my community garden. They paid $5,000 for it to Foster Enterprises. Alice picked up her phone, photographing each document. Patricia needs to see all this. But first, we need to prepare for this meeting. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. As Alice and her allies developed their strategy, more neighbors showed up with their own stories and evidence. A clear story of systematic abuse was beginning to emerge. By 7 p.m., the Riverside Heights Community Center was packed. Howard and Margaret Foster took their usual places at the head table, but something was different. The air of authority that usually surrounded them seemed to have diminished. Order. Howard banged his gavel, trying to control the hubbub of the crowd. This special meeting of the Riverside Heights Homeowners Association is officially open. Alice noticed that at least half of those present were wearing small green brooches, a symbol of support for their cause that Jennifer had hastily created. The Fosters clearly hadn't expected such a mobilization. The first item on the agenda, Margaret announced, her voice trembling slightly, is the proposed expulsion of Ms. Bennett for repeated violations of the community code and behavior detrimental to neighborhood harmony. Objection. Richard Thompson stood up. According to the HOA bylaws, any proposed expulsion requires 30 days' notice and documented evidence of serious violations. And it also requires a full financial audit, Jennifer added, lifting a stack of papers, including all transactions with consulting firms. Howard's face paled visibly. Margaret dropped her briefcase, scattering papers on the floor. "This meeting is adjourned," Howard declared, standing up abruptly. "No, it's not." A firm voice sounded from the back of the room. It was Kevin Morris from the Department of Works, accompanied by 2 policemen. "Mr. and Mrs. Foster, we have a warrant to seize all HOA financial records as part of an ongoing investigation." The chaos that ensued was almost cinematic. Margaret tried to run with a briefcase, but was stopped. Howard began frantically shredding documents until he was stopped. Neighbors filmed everything with their cell phones, while years of pent-up resentment exploded into shouts and accusations. Alice watched the scene with a surreal sense of triumph and sadness. This wasn't how she imagined her quiet life by the river. But sometimes the most important battles are the ones we don't choose to fight. "It's not over yet," Barbara whispered beside her. "They have resources and connections." "I know," Alice replied, watching as the Fosters were escorted out of the room. "But, for the first time in a long time, they don't have the power." The morning of the emergency hearing dawned with heavy clouds over West Lynn, reflecting the tension that hung over Riverside Heights. Alice adjusted her navy blue blazer as she climbed the stairs to the county courthouse, Patricia Dawson at her side, carrying a briefcase full of evidence. "The Fosters are here," Patricia whispered, indicating with a discreet movement of her head the couple who were talking intensely with their lawyer in the hallway. Margaret had swapped her usual designer clothes for a more sober ensemble, clearly trying to project an image of a respectable victim. "Mrs. Bennett?" a familiar voice called out. It was Kevin Morris from the Department of Works, accompanied by 2 investigators from the district attorney's office. "Can we talk for a minute before the hearing?" The small group gathered in an empty conference room. Kevin spread a folder on the table. "We've found irregularities in practically every building permit approved by the Fosters over the last 5 years, always favoring certain companies, always with inflated fees paid to the HOA, and always harming those who opposed them," added one of the investigators. "The pattern is crystal clear." Alice nodded, remembering all the stories she had heard in recent weeks. The Rodriguez forced to sell their house. Jennifer's community garden closed the arbitrary fines against Richard. Each piece of the puzzle revealed a larger scheme of corruption and intimidation. Judge Harrison's chambers were packed when the hearing began. In addition to the parties directly involved, dozens of Riverside Heights residents filled the seats, many still wearing their green brooches in support of Alice. The Fosters' lawyer, Maxwell Princeton III, opened the arguments with his usual theatrics. "Your Honor, my clients are exemplary citizens who have dedicated years of their lives to maintaining the high standards of Riverside Heights. This smear campaign orchestrated by Ms. Bennett." "Objection, Your Honor," Patricia interrupted. "There is no evidence of any smear campaign. The documented facts show." "Sustained," Judge Harrison declared, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Princeton, stick to the relevant facts of the case." The hearing proceeded with the presentation of evidence from both sides. Patricia methodically laid out each violation committed by the Fosters, the illegal construction, the misuse of HOA funds, the pattern of retaliation against residents. During a break, Alice noticed unusual movement near the courthouse windows. The sky had darkened considerably, and gusts of wind made the trees outside bend violently. "Storm coming," muttered Barbara, who was sitting behind her. "And not just in here." As if to confirm her words, Alice's cell phone vibrated with an urgent message. It was Jennifer Martinez. "Emergency in the neighborhood. The river is rising fast. We need help." Alice showed the message to Patricia, who immediately understood the irony of the situation. The same natural force that the Fosters had used as an excuse for their invasion now presented a real threat. "Your Honor," Patricia addressed the judge, "we have just received information about a weather emergency affecting the area in dispute. I request a brief interruption." Before she could finish, Howard Foster stood up abruptly. "Our garage—" "Margaret, all the documents are there." Judge Harrison observed the growing commotion in the room. "Given the situation, I'm going to declare a 2-hour recess. But I want to make it clear neither party is to remove or alter any evidence during this period." The rain was already falling heavily when Alice arrived in Riverside Heights, accompanied by Patricia and several neighbors. The river had risen significantly, and water was beginning to accumulate in the lower areas of the neighborhood. "The Foster's garage is right in the area most at risk," Kevin Morris explained, consulting a topographical map on his tablet. "If the river keeps rising at this rate, all the documents they've hidden there will be destroyed," Barbara added. Alice watched as the Fosters ran towards the illegal structure, clearly intending to remove something before it was too late. "Patricia!" Her lawyer was already on the phone to Judge Harrison, while Kevin was coordinating with the emergency team that was beginning to arrive. "We can't let them destroy evidence," Alice declared, "but we can't let them put themselves at risk either." The rain intensified, turning into a gray curtain that made visibility difficult. The sound of the river rising became more threatening by the minute. "Howard, Margaret!" Alice shouted through the storm. "Get out of there now! The structure isn't safe." For a moment, it looked as if the Fosters were going to ignore her. Then, a terrifying crash echoed through the valley. The reet, sound of earth giving way under water pressure. Part of the ravine where the garage had been built began to collapse. "Help!" Margaret's voice sounded in panic from inside the structure. Without hesitation, Alice ran towards the garage, followed by Kevin and some neighbors. They found Margaret, trying to drag out a heavy vault, while Howard was frantically stacking documents in a briefcase. "Forget it." Alice grabbed Margaret's arm. "We have to leave now." The group had barely reached safe ground when another section of the ravine gave way. The illegal garage symbol of so much conflict in recent weeks began to tilt dangerously towards the raging river. Dawn in Riverside Heights revealed the extent of the damage caused by the storm. The Fosters' garage had completely disappeared, swept away by the force of the river, along with years of compromising documents. Ironically, the very nature they had used as justification for their invasion turned out to be the instrument of their downfall. Alice was walking along the riverbank with Kevin Morris and a damage assessment team documenting the destruction. The gully where the garage had stood bore an irregular scar, a physical reminder of the conflict that had divided the community. "The good news is that we got more than enough evidence before the storm," Patricia commented, arriving at the scene, with a folder of documents protected in plastic. "The DA's office is moving forward with charges of fraud and misuse of HOA funds." Barbara Chen approached, carrying coffee for everyone. "Have you seen the news? The Fosters are staying at the Marriott." Margaret was seen crying in the lobby, saying she lost everything. "Not everything," Alice corrected, observing the Foster mansion still intact at the top of the hill. "They still have a lot more than most of the people they've harmed over the years." The morning progressed as cleanup crews began work in the affected area. Neighbors gathered in small groups, some helping to remove debris, others offering coffee and sandwiches to the workers. The tragedy, as is often the case, was bringing out the best in people. Jennifer Martinez organized a support station in her garage, coordinating volunteers and keeping a list of urgent needs for the affected residents. Richard Thompson used his contacts at City Hall to expedite structural assessments of the affected properties. "It's amazing how things change," Barbara commented, helping Alice catalog the damage to her property. A month ago, everyone was living in isolation, afraid of the Fosters' fines and retaliation. Now, look at this. Alice observed the scene around her. Children were helping to carry fallen branches. Teenagers were organizing an online fundraising campaign, and even grumpy Mr. Peterson, who rarely left the house, was helping to distribute drinking water. A familiar car parked next to the group. It was Howard Foster alone, and visibly haggard. For a moment, everyone froze, expecting yet another confrontation. But there was something different about his posture, a defeat that went beyond material loss. "Mrs. Bennet," he began, his voice hoarse. Margaret and I would like to propose an agreement." Patricia immediately positioned herself next to Alice, but she gestured for the lawyer to wait. "What kind of deal, Howard?" "We resign as president of the HOA. Permanently. We'll pay for the damages and legal costs. And," he hesitated as if the next words were physically painful, "we publicly apologize for everything." A heavy silence fell over the group. Years of conflict, intimidation, and abuse of power could not simply be erased with an apology. "Why now?" Alice asked, keeping her voice steady. Howard looked at the river, its still turbulent waters carrying debris. "Margaret is destroyed, not just because of the lost documents, but seeing all these people helping each other, working together. We realize that we've built something terrible here, a regime of fear, as someone said." "What about the money embezzled from the HOA?" Jennifer asked, approaching with other neighbors. "It will be returned, in full. Our son has already agreed to cooperate with the investigation into Foster Enterprises." Alice exchanged glances with Patricia, who nodded discreetly. An agreement could spare the community months of grueling legal battles and allow for a quicker restart. "We'll need everything in writing," Patricia declared. "And the public, confession needs to include all the schemes, not just the trespassing." Howard agreed, seeming to age years in a few minutes. "We'll do what's necessary." In the weeks that followed, Riverside Heights underwent a profound transformation. A new HOA board was democratically elected, with Jennifer Martinez as president and Richard Thompson as vice president. Rules were revised to ensure transparency and limit the power to intervene in private properties. The community garden was reopened and expanded. The Rodriguez were contacted and offered compensation that would allow them to return to the neighborhood if they wished. Each case of foster abuse was documented and dealt with, setting a precedent to prevent future excesses. On a quiet afternoon, exactly 1 month after the storm, Alice was on her rebuilt deck, looking out over the river that had changed so many lives. Barbara joined her, bringing a bottle of wine. "The Fosters have put the house up for sale," Barbara informed her, pouring 2 glasses. "Margaret says they're moving to Arizona near her sister." "Maybe that's for the best," Alice reflected. "Some damage takes more than apologies to repair." "But look what we've built from the ruins." Barbara gestured towards the neighborhood, where children played freely in gardens without regulation fences, and neighbors chatted about their hedges without fear of fines. Alice smiled, raising her glass. "To Riverside Heights. Not to what it was, but to what it can be." "And to the strength of storms," Barbara added with a smile. "Both the natural ones and the ones we create to fight for what's right." The sun was setting over the river, its now calm waters reflecting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere downstream, the remains of the Fosters' garage probably rested on the bed, a submerged monument to an era of fear that had finally come to an end. But here, on the banks that had witnessed so much change, a stronger community was emerging, built not on rules and threats, but on mutual respect and the courage to stand up to injustice. The gentle breeze carried the sound of laughter and chatter. From the neighbors gathered in the community garden, planning the autumn festival that would be the first of many truly community events. Alice closed her eyes, absorbing the moment. Some battles are worth fighting, not just for what we can win, but for what we can become by fighting them.